The videos I prepare on aspects of the Coronado expedition assume a basic and common understanding, but I've come to learn that there's not a common, accurate understanding of this expedition. There's many misconceptions about the basic history, especially since we've learned so much in the last decade or two. So this is a brief introduction, a brief background on the Coronado expedition. Now, these were the first Europeans to enter the American Southwest, and that's what makes this so important because it's the first interactions in this area between Europeans and natives. Now, their goal was to get to Cibola, or the Seven Cities of Gold, which we now know as Zuni, and they ended up going much further north than that, up into Kansas via Texas and so on. But their initial goal was to get to a place that we refer to as Cibola. In doing so, they went through Sibaiprhi O'odham territory. O'odham descendants live today in various reservations and communities in Arizona and northern Mexico. And the ones specifically that I'm talking about here are the Sibaiprhi O'odham, whose direct descendants live at San Javier del Bac, or Oaxaca, in the Tucson area. The Sibaiprhi O'odham territory is shown here in purple, and you can see that two of the key Coronado expedition sites that we've found that are named in the documents and found in the archaeological record are at the southwest and east side of this purple area that represents the Sibaiprhi O'odham homeland. This is the heartland of Sibaiprhi O'odham territory as we understand it today. When the Coronado expedition came through, the native inhabitants of the area were essentially the same as those that were present when Father Kino came through and drew this map in the 1690s. And he documented in this specific area the Sibaiprhi O'odham, the ancestral Apache, and the Hokome. The Coronado expedition likely encountered at least two of these groups, if not more, in this specific area. Now, the expedition came through between 1539 and 1542, and importantly, the 1539 portion of this is in some ways the most important for southeastern Arizona and the native groups present, and the expedition itself. Some of the most important interactions between Europeans and natives occurred in the first 6 months of the expedition in this area. In fact, perhaps you might be able to argue that in the first 30 days, some of the most important interactions occurred. It's important to understand that the expedition occurred in phases or stages, and that these stages are critical for understanding not only the sequence of events, but interpreting the documents and the archaeological record. So first, Fray Marcos de Niza came through southeastern Arizona, and with him was Esteban the Black Moor. They came through in late April and early May. Now, Esteban was a week or so ahead of Fray Marcos. He was in advance, so he was the first non-native to enter this area as far as we know. 6 or 7 months later, in the winter of 1539, Melchor Diaz passed through this area with 17 horsemen and a captain. And their goal was to get to Cibola to check on Fray Marcos's reports of what he had seen. But because of deep snows and cold weather, they stayed on the San Pedro River in southeast Arizona at a place referred to as Chichilticalli. They left after about 2 months after a battle with the local Sibaiprhi O'odham residents. The battle likely occurred in early 1540. This is the earliest known battle between Native Americans and Europeans in the American Southwest. Then, 4 months or so after Diaz, in June, late June of 1540, Coronado came through with the chronicler Juan Jaramillo, who wrote about the expedition. So about 4 months later, the main body of the expedition came through. This would have been in the fall of 1540. They left Signora to the south in September and October of 1540. Castaneda, another chronicler for the expedition, was with this stage of the expedition. So clearly his experiences and his stories are going to differ to some extent from Jaramillo and Coronado. Throughout the entire term of the expedition, there was a series of small trips, messengers, scouts, exploratory parties moving throughout this area. And then, important to the discussion is the establishment of San Jeronimo III in the Suya Valley, also known as Suya, which is the first European town site in the American Southwest. This was established probably in June of 1541. Shortly thereafter, Tovar moved half of the residents to the Tihua province in the Albuquerque area. Shortly thereafter, a major battle occurred at Suya in 1541. And this is where the cannons were found and a wide range of Coronado expedition artifacts. So all of these stages are important for understanding the expedition. And without the framework of this series of stages, we can't understand changes through time and the relationship between events. There were about 2,800 people and thousands of head of livestock who came through this area. The people included about 390 Spanish men or European men, and then they had slaves and domestic servants, some wives, perhaps some children, and Indios Amigos, or native Mexican allies who came up with them. And those groups comprised the 2,800 people. The stages occurred in late spring, then winter, then summer and fall, so at all different seasons. And importantly, the groups moved across the landscape in companies. So they were broken down, these stages were broken down into companies who moved across the landscape and sometimes camped at the same campsites and in other cases nearby. Within these areas where they camped, there's also individual camping areas where cohorts or so on camped. And then in addition to these stages, we have emissaries and scouts who moved across the landscape. So as a result, we have a series of small sites that represent overnight encampments. People were moving across the landscape successively in smaller groups of maybe 50 to 150 people. And so even with Fray Marcos de Niza, we have Esteban in advance of the friar. He was attempting to verify the route, clear the way, and announce the arrival of the group. So we have a series of 3 classes of archaeological sites. The smallest sites represent overnight encampments. They may have been occupied one night or perhaps a couple of nights. They may have been occupied once or successively by different groups within the expedition and different stages. We have one large town site, Suya or San Jeronimo III, in the Suya Valley. And then we have a 2-month-long winter encampment at Chichilticalli that was occupied in the winter beginning in 1539 by Diaz. This represents the array of sites that we have that occurred during these stages of the expedition. And so these sites represent subsets of the expedition. This shows the route of the expedition from the initial site we discovered, our first site, San Jeronimo III in the Suya Valley, and then a series of overnight encampments between there and Chichilticalli and on the way to Cibola. So this framework provides a foundation to understand other videos I'll prepare on this expedition. And basically it changes the notion that people have had that 2,800 people and thousands of head of livestock were moving in mass across the landscape. That just didn't happen. The archaeology is showing that that didn't happen. And interpretations of the documentary record also suggest that that didn't happen. So with this new conceptualization that's been developing over a couple of decades now, you can start to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing and so on. And you can place the historical events that I'll be discussing in other videos in the context of this framework.